escape velocity is undermined today.
We built a business that served, 16 million small businesses.
But there's a massive cost to that.
I think I've always been someone who, looks for.
All right, guys, welcome back to Built in America. We have Neil Feather here. He is the president of Point Wild. Neil, how's it going?
Going great. How are you doing, Sam?
I'm doing good. Neil, who's the man beneath the resume over here? Tell me a little about the background.
Sure thing. Yeah. So, was, out of college, worked for 10 years at Johnson & Johnson, kind of caught the entrepreneurial bug in 2006, and then founded SiteHawk in 2008, and then have been kind of in cybersecurity ever since. So happy to dive into details, but that's kind of the broad strokes of the career side of things. In personal life, I'm married. I have 3 kids. They keep us very, very busy, and with all their activities. But love spending time with the family as well.
Talk to me a little about Point Wild. I want to dive into that on why you felt it's a pivotal moment to build a company like this, and then what is a unique product about here.
Yeah, I think with Point Wild, what we feel like is cybersecurity for consumers is more top of mind than ever. And so what we wanted to do here is really build a company that enables us to offer cybersecurity products to consumers as and when they're needed and wherever consumers are at. So what we've done here is build a really strong platform that enables us to go to market in a variety of different ways and answer specific consumer questions about cybersecurity and respond to specific needs that they have immediately, and and really, like I say, kind of meet consumers where they are, rather than necessarily build a kind of one size fits all consumer security mousetrap.
Neil, what do you feel the difference is cybersecurity today versus 10 to 15 years ago? As I think a lot has changed with AI, innovation, and I'm sure there's a lot that has progressed in cybersecurity. Where do you stand on that today?
But, I think a lot's changed. But probably, what people feel most is that it's something that you need to think about in a way. It needs to be part of your, part of your life in a way that you wouldn't have thought 10 years ago, maybe. And what I mean when I say that is, it's not something that most consumers think about, every day, every waking minute, but it is something that people are aware of in a similar way that they're aware of the need for maybe homeowners insurance or life insurance, right? Not something you think about every day, but something you're aware of and something that you need. And so I think because of the just increasing threat and just prevalence of, breaches and cyber attacks, consumers have just been forced to become more aware of it. I think where what we see sometimes is we're almost getting past that point where people are aware of it, and in some cases kind of becoming numb to the constant messaging around cybersecurity. And so that's where we aim to differentiate again, is being, focused on specific needs consumers have and what they're after in cybersecurity, rather than just talking, security, be secure, be more safe, be secure, that sort of thing.
Neil, I'm curious about building the company Point Wild, how it all started, the journey of you buying the domain of Point Wild and then, scaling it to where it is today. Walk us through that journey a little bit, how you and your partner got it going, and then where the company is today.
Yeah. So we were, so Point Wild has been built through a series of acquisitions. And so, we've built a bunch of technology, but we've also acquired a lot of technology over time. And so I started here in 2021. And the idea at that time was that we were going to take a lot of the pieces of technology and spin out from our sister company at the time, which is called Aura. They're also doing something very interesting and unique in the area of kind of digital wellness. And so Point Wild had a very different type of kind of corporate thesis around, more M&A driven growth and, more kind of specific targeted cybersecurity solutions for consumers. And so that was kind of the original genesis. And at that point, we were still calling ourselves Pango. So we split out in 2021 and really started going about building a company that, again, was focused on specific acute solutions for cybersecurity needs. So if a consumer needs VPN, we want to be able to provide it. If they need antivirus, we want to be able to provide it. If they need identity protection, password manager, all these things. So we can either offer these solutions individually or as part of a product suite. And then, depending on what each consumer needs and where they need these things, we'd be able to offer that. So that was kind of the thought process because, there's a little bit of a zig when everybody was zagging. When you look at a lot of what cybersecurity companies were about at that time, it was all in one, suite type products, which we have as well. But we also are able to cut that up and divide it not only for our end directly to consumer, but also through a channel of reseller partners where we're able to supplement their offerings, whether that's a, cybersecurity provider, an insurance provider, a financial institution, where they're able to add, a feature here, a feature there that really dovetails well with what they're offering. And again, just kind of meet specific consumer needs exactly how consumers want to be served. So that was kind of the genesis there. And then from there to now, there's been a ton of innovation on the product side, as well as a number of significant acquisitions we've made over the past, 3 or 4 years.
I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are very interested in doing a lot more acquisitions. I'm in the space of acquisitions for the last several years, and there's an inorganic approach to growing and an organic approach to growing, and understanding how to go balance both, right? Because a lot of times people think, well, I can just go buy a bunch of revenue, buy a bunch of EBITDA, and then get to $100 million rather quickly. But then you're just compiling a bunch of companies together and slapping them together, where it's a unorganized, dysfunctioning group of companies, and you probably have to go balance that by having a methodical way of going about this. Tell me about that process of how you understand how to grow companies organically versus an inorganic approach.
Yeah, I think when we're buying companies, like you always have to have a thesis about how you're going to add value on top of what they're doing. Because unless the company is just really poorly run, which is unusual when they hit in a company that's of scale, you've got to be able to add something beyond what the company's doing today, right? And so if you feel like, well, it's going to make us bigger, you're not really adding value. So maybe you can still, when you go to sell, maybe you can sell for the same amount, but unless you're adding something specific to it, putting a platform behind it, or, leveraging some other aspect of the business, it's not creating any value out there. So the way we think about it when we're going to buy companies is, how are we going to, bring this in and find ways that we can add value through our product, and then also through the acquired or merged business, how are they adding value back into our portfolio as well? So, it's a cliche, but we always try to look for things where, it's a 1 + 1 = 3 type of acquisition. Because if all you're doing is adding revenue, it's just not that exciting, right? From that perspective. So now that's, you mentioned kind of organic growth, because once you bring it in, that value add you're talking about is around the organic growth, the product diversification. Maybe it's around developing more internal IP, or swapping. It could also be cost synergies that you're able to realize. So there's a number of different things that could happen there, but to add value. But I think you've got to be able to, like I say, add value in a certain way. Either it's going to be through revenue growth, which is the most obvious thing, but there's also a lot of things on the back end you can do from a cost synergy perspective, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody thinks about cost synergy like, oh, we're going to, replace this group of people or whatever. And sometimes that may happen, but generally what we've seen is more, technology swap outs, and being able to add value that way rather than the people side. And then how do you create a growth story that encompasses our current business plus the acquired business is kind of that key balance.
I've spent a lot of time in doing levered rollups for a while. And what we try to do is consolidate the back end and, share a lot of ERP systems, finance, marketing, and deploy that across all the different portcos. We've had some great success stories. We've had some really shitty stories as well, right? Give us a case study on, an acquisition that you guys did that like no other.
We got a couple right now that have been really good. So good examples of that. So last year we did an acquisition of a company called Simpluris. It's been a great asset for our business. We already had so Simpluris, for folks who don't know, it is in the operational legal space. They're a class action administrator. We already had a business called SciX that was operating in the class action data breach space. And so putting those businesses together for us made a lot of sense because it gave us operational leverage. We had also our customers were in some cases in common or in similar industries. So we were able to put that together and drive some revenue synergy. We've now kind of fully integrated that business and we're seeing a bunch of really nice synergy, both from a cross-sell, upsell perspective, and also from the standpoint of being able to really integrate operations there. So we've seen it kind of both ways, where we're now seeing a bunch of opportunity where customers from one business are now becoming customers of the other business, and vice versa. And so, it's been a really nice success story there on the revenue side, and it's generated, significant growth year over year in the mid double digits, basically year over year. Another one we did last year, we bought and merged with a couple of different antivirus providers, and so we have built our own internal antivirus product, and so now we're able to, kind of have more of a footprint in antivirus than we originally, had a year ago. And it's given us a lot of good insight into what that market needs and helped us not only generate revenue on antivirus side, but also make our product a lot better because now we're getting a ton of data that we weren't able to see when we had a very small install base. Now with the larger install base, you may have read about the kind of one that we did, which was bringing on the customer base of Kaspersky in the US onto our platform. Those customers are going to be without security, so we thought this is a good opportunity to help out consumers, as well as bring on additional customers onto our platform that we could start to get more and more threat intelligence and build out an even stronger product, basically.
Neil, in the world of acquiring cybersecurity companies, there's a lot of nuances. In the world of acquisitions today, we generally buy things based off of EBITDA multiple, sometimes even a revenue multiple today. Walk us through kind of the market of cybersecurity, how you guys value businesses, key markers you guys look for, and what's important to you.
I mean, yeah. So for us, the key thing is that, you're solving a consumer need, and then everything else kind of flows from there. I think, when we look at kind of the multiples tend to vary quite a bit depending on, as any number of factors, whether it be growth, profitability, just margin profile, total market size, all those types of things. So when we look at businesses, the things that we're looking for that fit our model well is proven market fit, good size and scale and growth, and then a strong profitability profile. So we're not the type of business that's just going to go out and buy, for very speculative, burning tons of money type of assets. We're going to be more in the, hey, this is a proven solution for consumer needs and is not only generating revenue but also profitable on the back end of it.
I'm sure there's beyond moving pieces to get all these things done by managing this back end and then also doing all these M&A. And there's a big philosophical part I like to always dive deep into. Entrepreneurs like yourself who come on this pod and make it look so grand on I'm just going to go raise money, buy a bunch of companies, now we're at $100 million in revenue plus, right? And a lot of people in the audience sometimes don't resonate with that. And they don't get to understand the sunken cost of also building a business and the downside of that sometimes too. What is something that you had to learn along the way that was probably a big failure throughout this process that has dramatically impacted and changed the way you view operating this company today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you go back to so one of the nice things here is that when I started at Point Wild, we already had, a nice kit of revenue, a nice kit of EBITDA, good growing asset. So we didn't have a lot of the kind of, startup garage headaches that you find, in some companies. I think though, if you go back to the previous company I was at, which was called SiteLock, like we started that from literally $0. And so, you know, I remember doing things like, um, assembling desks, assembling chairs, that sort of like entrepreneur garage type thing that you hear about. But I think the biggest learning for me, because like I came from a big company. I was at, like I said, Johnson & Johnson for 10 years, great company, and had a lot of really good experiences there before I kind of caught the entrepreneurial bug. And so my thinking at the time was, it's a really good thing to grab folks from large companies who want to make a change and plug them into, an entrepreneurial environment. Um, that was turned out to be like a really big mistake, and we ended up making some pretty bad hiring decisions because of that. And the reason being, I think to a lot of folks, like being in a startup sounds cool and sounds fun and exciting, and it is all those things. But it's also a grind, and you're in the weeds of doing things, and some of that stuff sounds interesting until you do it for a week. And so we really changed our hiring profile as a result to find people who were much more hungry, have had experience working in lean companies, that sort of thing. Because what we found was that when people come over from large businesses, there's a certain level of support and infrastructure and just budget that they expect, because it's what they've always been around. And when you get to a startup and you ask, who's going to generate, who generates this report for me, the answer is you generate it. So, it's just a different mindset and a really hard shift for some folks to make. Some folks do it great and do it seamlessly. But what we found is, that can be a very challenging transition. And it really did change the way we hire.
It's funny you say that. So I had a 10-year medical device background as well. So I know J&J, quite in depth. And I worked for lower middle market companies when I first got started, and then built a medical device company shortly thereafter. And what I saw when I was distributing for these medical device companies as well is these guys who came from Stryker and these big companies came down to a lower middle market business, just like you said, and they miserably failed because of the lack of resources was so new to them, right? And I think one of the best things people would understand is that when you have to be resourceful and get scrappy, you start learning a lot, and you get the hard knocks MBA of all those aspects of running a business. I saw you got an MBA. You did go to Wharton. And there's a lot of people today who are curious about, what does an MBA really offer? Is it worth the while? Is it really relationships? Should you just go and start a business today? There's a fork in the road that's happening in society of wondering whether that education is viable or not. Give me your thesis on that.
I think it depends on the person. Some folks will really benefit from, that experience. And, not only the kind of academic rigor and what you learn in the classroom, but also, to your point, the networking. I mean, I met people there who are, lifelong connections, and including our CEO at Point Wild, and or was a classmate of mine in grad school, and I've worked with him now for almost 20 years. So there's definitely something too, from my experience, the connections that you make when you're in a place like that. It kind of, it's an intense experience, and it kind of bonds people together in a way that is tougher to do in other environments. That said, I think that one thing that's important when you go to a program like that is that you have some real world experience. This is my perspective, that you get a lot more out of what you're learning in class when you have real world situations that you can apply it to. And you've had experience working with different departments, financial statements, that sort of thing. Where I went was a very financially focused, like you said, the Wharton School is very financially focused business. So if you haven't dived into a P&L, done an acquisition, looked at a merger, done some kind of analysis there, you're probably not going to get as much out of it because it feels very theoretical. So I think having that experience is important. for another set of people, I think experiential learners, like there's no substitute for doing it, right? So um, I think both have their place, and going out and starting a company, I often talk about it in like dog years. You're learning 7 years of what you learn working in a corporation every year at a startup. It's just a pace of things and the amount that you have to do yourself versus asking other people to help and do. That learning curve is vertical compared to what you'd get working in a large company. And like I say, there's a time and place for all that. We both worked in large organizations and small. And it's no criticism of large organizations. They're great learning places to learn and gain experience, but the pace of learning is just not gonna match what you're getting in a startup if you really want to be successful in building a business.
Yeah, I think the word escape velocity is undermined today of knowing what that feels like, especially at an early age, because I think it's that intensity is something that will fuel you to want to go do more rather than being constrained in a environment where you have a ton of resources like we discussed, and you're just solely obligated to do just a couple things, and you're monitored by those few little items, and then you're reporting to a middle market manager, right? Um, One thing I'm very curious of where you guys stand today is I know you're the president of the company. You sit very high up at the totem pole, and there's an aspect of hiring operators and understanding who the best people in the team should be. And there's a time where you have to go fire fast, and there's a time where you have to coach hard. And that's another dichotomy that a lot of people have to understand. When do you know how to fire someone first, keep them on board, and continue to coach them?
Yeah, I think it comes down to there's a variety of factors, but for me, like it's fit and kind of mindset more than skill. Like for me, if the person has the right mindset and they're working hard and they're willing to learn and be coached, I'd always try to take that individual and either find another role for them that works better, or make sure that they're being coached appropriately and growing and learning the skills that we need for them to have here. um, when you can see that, you know, the fit isn't right for whatever reason, maybe it's, like we talked about, lack of resources, or, just desire to kind of, believe in the vision that we have here as far as, protecting consumers and that sort of thing. If that's not a passion area for folks, and it feels like, you know, they're forcing themselves into work every day. It's a chore. I think those are the types of folks that we would want to move out, and the folks that we'd want to coach up are the ones who really fit in well with the culture, with the vision of the company, the mission of the company, and that sort of thing.
Tell me a little about the values and the mission of the company. I think it's always important to set high quality values and missions from day one and make sure the rest of the team follows that. What would that be for Point Wild?
Yeah, for us, I mean, we want to be able, like I say, to deliver cybersecurity products to every consumer, and everywhere in the world. So that's kind of the high level mission. I think from a values perspective, we want to obviously do that with integrity. We want to, from a team standpoint, we have a pretty hard and fast rule. No politics, data driven decision making, and we're going to do what's best for the company and our stakeholders, kind of financially. Our first responsibility is to our consumers, of course, but right after that is the company. Because it's easy to start thinking about things as, how does it affect me? How does it affect my team? And while it's important, the most important thing we need to do is make sure that we're doing what's right for the business. So that's kind of the way we think about managing things here, and how we manage the culture and the vision of the company.
Neil, as you're always fast forwarding, you're setting goals for companies, right? You got a 12-month goal, a 3-year goal, a 10-year goal, right? And setting a vision can be somewhat contradicting sometimes, because sometimes you don't know if that needle is always moving the right direction. If you were to kind of put the globe out there, the crystal ball of where Point Wild is going over the next 3 years, what would that look like?
I think it's a great question. One that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Well, like I said, what we're trying to do is build a platform that enables us to adapt to the changing landscape of the consumer cybersecurity need. It is, like we talked about earlier, evolving very quickly. And we feel like we have built that platform where we can either build onto it any new solution or any existing solution that our consumers are asking for and needing, or go out and acquire a new solution and plug it into that platform. So we see ourselves as being, that kind of, again, cliche word, but one-stop shop for cybersecurity for consumers and small businesses. I think that's one thing we're really adding on is the small business component over the next, year or two. It's already in progress, and we're moving in that direction. So I think that'll be a big change. And I think the other thing we want to do is make sure that we continue to deliver, our significant growth and significant profitability, and not just for the sake of numbers and dollars, but what it means for the business is that gives us continued financial flexibility to, do more for our customers, acquire more product technology that meets needs that consumers have, build more product and technology that anticipates those needs. And so to me, like building that core, a really strong core business is what enables everything else down the line and the achievement of those 3 and 10-year goals.
Yeah, I mean, look, setting goals is never an easy task, and getting people aligned is always an exercise that we're continuously always working on and moving the needle, right? And I think sometimes in building a large company like you guys have done, there's something I like to always underscore, as well as someone like yourself in a position as a CEO, a president, is assuring that you're still happy in the process. We talk a lot about revenue, we talk a lot about profitability, building companies, and then one day we close our eyes and we're 80 years old and we're like, what just happened, right? And assuring that, hey, did we enjoy this process? And how do we understand today to be in the present moment to assure that we're working on the right things that are actually fulfilling our cup? How would you define that?
I think, for me, and again, this varies for every person, cybersecurity is an area where we're able to, it's definitely a business, and we're a profit-driven company. We're not a charity, but we are doing something really good for people, and helping them stay safe and protect their data and that sort of thing. So that helps me personally feel really good about what we're doing, what we're building here. I think the other thing is, at the risk of giving advice to folks, like, you got to find good people to work with and people that you enjoy spending time with. You're spending as much time, most of us are spending as much time with people at work or more than we're spending at home with family, for better or worse. And so, if that's a challenge, and going to meetings is a chore, and you don't want to see these folks, like, that's going to make your life very challenging and very stressful. I think one of the things that I took for granted early in my career was that everyone was kind of interested in working together toward the same goal and had each other's best interests at heart. Through some experiences, kind of started to realize that that's not always true. And that's really shaped the way that I think about building teams, building culture, and, the types of folks that I want to work with. And so to me, like, building that fulfilling, work life balance, if you will, or that experience at work also really comes down to the people that you work with, and making sure that they're the types of folks who are, match your values, whatever those may be.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think also fulfillment comes from also being fulfilled with yourself and your skill sets that you've incurred over time, and being confident with that, and then being able to go offer those resources to other people. As you're, a novice in your career, you've definitely progressed a ton by building a company, this multiple companies, working at J&J. When have you felt that you've really peaked, and like you've found your own and your skill sets have finally shined? What was that inflection moment for you?
I hope I haven't peaked. That'd be my short answer to that. I hope that I have good stuff ahead. But I think everybody is, and I'm no exception. A lot of folks are very critical of themselves, right? And so it's easy to always find things we could do better, and that sort of thing. And I think that's kind of the way I look at it. We've had some great achievements, right? We built a business that served 16 million small businesses. We had great financial exits to private equity, to strategics. But looking back on it, I see so many things that we could have done better and that would have changed the dynamics in a really positive way. But you get one shot at it. I think one of the things that for me I've learned is that you got to kind of um, accept those things and move on. So I hope I haven't peaked. I always look back and see things that we could have done better. But I think when you start to have some of those milestones of the first $1 million revenue, the first million customers, the first 10 million businesses, like those are times when hopefully you can take even a second to just reflect and remember where you were when that happened and that sort of thing. And I have a few of those through my life. Like the first time we sold a business was one of those, and that sort of thing. So I think though, hopefully very much so, the best is ahead.
Yeah, let's rephrase that and say you haven't peaked, you're chasing greatness continuously. It's a never ending journey, right? And there's obviously a cost of chasing greatness that also not many people talk about. You have a family, I'm sure. I don't know if you have kids or not, but with that balancing, like we talked about, a work-life balance is not easy, especially at your level. And I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast as well is like they want to go chase greatness and be the best at their craft and go build a massive big business. But there's a massive cost to that. And what is that cost to you?
Yeah, I guess I view it as it's certainly like time that I'm spending here is time that I'm not spending with my family, right? That's a clear trade-off. But, I think that it also, having success in business also enables you to do things for your family and in your personal life that you wouldn't be able to do without that type of success, right? So I think there's a little bit of a synergy across that is, sometimes overlooked in the phraseology of work-life balance, right? Where it feels like you take away from one, you give to the other. And that's not always true. And I think that that said, there's a lot of early mornings, late nights, there's a lot of travel, and that can be a grind just from, a physical and mental kind of exhaustion standpoint. But, I think that, that's kind of the trade-off you make in some way, to do really interesting things, and work with really interesting people sometimes requires you to, accept some of that, that struggle or that sacrifice. And, for me, that's worth it. Like you say, it may not be worth it for everybody. But that's definitely part of the job is the way I think about it.
Sometimes I don't get asked this question enough, and I got it asked not long ago, and we've gone through this journey for a decade plus of building companies, and then someone posed the question to me the other day: is like, just what's one thing that you would change, and the biggest learning lesson throughout the process. If I were to pose that question to you, of if you could change one thing from the day you left Wharton to where you are today, what would that be?
That's a great question. Not one that I thought about, like you said. I think there's so many. On the one hand, there's so many things I would do differently if I went back to that time, right? And small decisions are large. On the other hand, I look at it and it's all kind of brought me here, which is a little, maybe obvious, but I think what I would probably do differently, just broadly speaking, is just take bigger swings. I think I've always been someone who, looks for incremental improvement, and that's been very valuable in a variety of places. But, I've also been a little reluctant sometimes to, make big bets, and, take big swings and so that's something that I think, had I been more willing to do that, especially earlier in my career, it might have made a really significant impact in, just the trajectory of things and of companies that I worked with as well, where we could have, grown even faster and done even more for the security landscape and for customers and that sort of thing. So if anything, I think it's rare to look back and say, I'm upset that we tried that. And, that's something that I think having hindsight, I wish we would have done more of is, make some of those bigger, larger bets.
Let's talk about that. People are always scared of doing big swings, right? And there's usually fear around something, and fear to me is defined by usually a lack of repetition of something, right? Because if you haven't done it, you're less willing to go take big swings, right? And confidence usually is a derivative of having a lot of repetition in one area, right? If I were to say that, talk to you about cybersecurity and I would put you on a podcast today, only talking about cybersecurity, you'd be pretty confident in talking about that, which would lead you to take bigger swings today. Fair?
Mhm.
So define how to go take bigger swings for people listening to this podcast and what they should do. And in my view of taking big swings, there's always a positive lesson. Whether you completely fuck it up or not, you will always get something really good on the other side of it, right? Because it's only the time horizon until you realize whether that mistake was a lesson that can be learned over time. I even look at this as, when someone passes in your life, whether a best friend or a family member, you realize, in the current moment, it's really sad and it hurts. But 5-10 years from now, you realize how precious life is. And I think people lose sight of the valuable lesson there. And that's why I think taking big swings is a very valuable part of a career and a life journey, because you want to go back at the age of 70 and say, wow, I took this awesome big swing that led to this. And it's going to tell a great story. So if I'm a young listener today and I'm 19 years old and I'm ready to go swing for the fences, bigger than Barry Bonds, what would you advise me to go do?
Yeah, I think especially early in your career, like that's the absolute best time to try to take big swings. Not that you can't do it later, but you're still everything's learning right at that point, right? Because you haven't really had a ton of experience, so everything's going to feel a little uncomfortable. And so taking a big swing for you might be, for one person might look different from for someone else. But I think I would encourage people to do those things that they're interested in and passionate about, and figure out how to money will come, right? Like if you do something and you're doing it really well and you're really interested in it and really passionate about it, you'll find a way to make that successful from a financial standpoint. And so my I guess advice or encouragement would be, find what that thing is that's really interesting to you, that's really exciting to you, and go learn everything you can about it, and do it to the best you can do it, and then come back and try to figure out, okay, is there like an actual business model in this thing, or is this more like a hobby for me, right? But either way, I think that experience of going deep on something, learning, getting really, really good at something is going to serve, even if, you start going, 100% east and you realize that actually I need to be going, southeast or south, you're at least moving in a direction, and you can pivot off of that rather than being standing still.
I love that. I think movement is important. Like the actual art of doing is so important throughout a journey. And even if you're going in the wrong direction, you're still moving, and there's lessons to learn on the way. And I don't think that's the advice you gave is impeccable. And I don't think you need to go to Wharton to go learn that, right? I think it's something that you're just going to go incur over time by actually taking massive action.
Sure. Yeah, I think like the academics is great, and it's been wonderful for me. I had a great experience there and undergrad as well, but like it's not for everybody. And there is absolutely value in learning by doing. Like I said, you learn so much by starting a business, starting a service organization, and anything that you're doing hands on by yourself is just going to be a totally different type of learning, not only in the pace of it, but also how it impacts you and how much you internalize that. It's one thing to read about it in a book. It's another thing to go do it and fail and fail and fail. And then, figure out, oh, this is how I actually need to do this. And this is how it'll work. That kind of learning you can't always get in school.
As we wrap up this podcast, I always like to ask, a deep, thoughtful, probing question, as maybe I asked a few throughout this pod already. And this is something that highly resonates with me. Is I always like to reflect and think about this. Is you've obviously had a ton of very successful people around you to go build massive companies, and I'm sure that people are always approaching you for different advice, ideas, opportunities. And I assume that people don't ask this question enough. And if I were to ask you this, I would be very curious to know how you respond, and hope that other people will do this for you in the future. Is what's a question that you feel that you wish people ask you more often?
That's a great question. And one that I think, I need a second to kind of think about. But, I think one thing, if you think about, just kind of from a career or business building perspective, one of the things that I really enjoy is working with, younger people, helping them learn, helping them grow. And so, I think what people will often ask is, tell me about the history and, the success and that sort of thing. I think that's great. And it's sometimes exciting to hear about, and people get, amped up about whether it's numbers or, products or whatever. And that is exciting stuff. I think one thing that, people don't always think about is, what's the kind of, um, the like the approach, or how do you get involved in this? I think for me, like, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, like I tend to be a very conservative type of person, right? Incremental approach, that sort of thing. But um, to me, taking that first leap and step into entrepreneurship. And so when I think about like questions people could ask is like, how do I get started? Right. Because I think what people see is the finish line, and that can be exciting, right? And they see, an exit, or they see a revenue number or customer count or something like that. But I think it's how do I get started? How do I take that first step, right? Whether it be in your, something you want to do in your personal life, or something you want to do from an entrepreneurship standpoint, and how do you get comfortable taking that first step? I think is something that folks don't think about, don't ask about. It's much easier, or more, maybe more interesting to hear, the end point than the starting point,
Neil, you've been a wealth of knowledge here. Appreciate your time. If where can people find more about Neil, yourself, and Point Wild?
So for me, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the thing I use the most, but Point Wild is just pointwild.com. And, come check us out. We've got a bunch of content there about our businesses, as well as, cybersecurity and threat intelligence.
That's the pod. Thanks, Neil.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam.